Yes, I am Caleb Hearth. Today we're going to go over 5 main things that Rails is well known for, but which it did not invent. Model view controller, REST, convention over configuration, active record, and Merb. And I promise it's the only bullet points slide that you'll see. Model view controller, or MVC, was originally written up by Trygve Reenskaug in 1979, so it predates Rails quite a bit. Reenskaug spent 1978 through 79 at the Xerox. I'm going to switch mics. Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, better known as Xerox PARC, as a visiting scientist with the Learning Research Group. While there, he spent time working on programs for the Dynabook, specifically a project management tool called Procon, which provided the frame for the model view controller pattern. This is not Trygve. This is Alan Kay holding the Dynabook. Xerox PARC famously incubated a number of other influential products and ideas, including laser printers, bitmap graphics, graphical user interfaces, including windows, icons, and mice as pointer devices, object-oriented programming, including class and prototype inheritance patterns, the Smalltalk programming language, which Ruby is heavily inspired by, and even integrated development environments, or IDEs. While at PARC, Reenskaug worked with Adele Goldberg, Dave Robson, and others, and wrote several letters describing Thing Model View Editor and tracing its evolution into Model View Controller as we know it. MVC for Reenskaug was more concerned with how GUI's program would be constructed than how we might now think in Rails of servers and networks and browsers. MVC was conceived as a general solution to the problem of users controlling a large and complex data set. A model represented knowledge at some level of abstraction. An example of different levels of abstraction he mentions in models views controllers is a calendar appointment versus a paragraph, so slightly different than you might be used to. Reenskaug's views and controllers are even less analogous to Rails similar concepts. In his paper, a view was purely representational and wouldn't have contained something like a form. And a controller coordinated many views, not just one, and represented different parts of the GUI visible to the viewer. Sometimes the views could provide editors, a concept present in MVC, but more or less absent in our modern representation, especially in Rails. You can see it a little bit more clearly in other MVC frameworks. An editor was a special kind of controller that could provide, that a view could provide to a controller as an ephemeral object used to modify data. The only valid way of getting a controller, an editor, was for a controller to ask a view for it. The closest analogy I've thought of to a view passing a controller to an editor is an HTML form element, where an HTML view renders an HTML form, which sends data over HTTP to a controller on the server. In a sense, the controller has requested this when it rendered the page that view itself renders that form inside. And the view creates it by structuring the markup as part of itself, and the browser then handles that glue to connect the changes that the editor wants to make to the model layer. Of the concepts that we're going to go over today, MVC is probably the most straightforward to see how it manifests in Ruby on Rails, because it's right in how we structure our code. Subdirectories under app for our models, views, and controllers. And this is how everybody's app folder looks, right? Rails models abstract SQL operations, provide validations, map columns to the database, to Ruby's data types, and hold a lot of business logic. We'll get more into that in the active record section. That sounds so much better. Should I start over? Its views are usually abstractions around HTML or JSON representations of data in that model, sometimes including interactive elements. Controllers provide a glue layer that converts browser or client requests over HTTP to messages that the model understands and passes the results back to the view layer in most cases. rest. Education was once described to me by a professor as exploring within a sphere of knowledge, representing all human understanding. We start in the middle, knowing nothing, and then expand in all directions as we're exposed to all sorts of information by teachers and professors and parents and friends, but limited in that knowledge to which we already have the tools to understand. As we learn more, we're provided with deeper learning in areas of knowledge that are now accessible to us. And hopefully some of that piques our interest as we seek out even more in these areas and we expand our area within that sphere as we as individuals understand. And almost every individual is going to have a unique pattern within that sphere. In order to receive a post-secondary degree like a master's or a doctorate, we have to write theses or dissertations. In doing so, we finally have to reach the edge of what that sphere of knowledge, and we go even further, making the tiniest dent in the sphere of knowledge. And as more people create, more and more people create these tiny dents, the sphere itself is expanded for future generations. When Roy Fielding sought to expand human understanding, he did so by formalizing the description of representational state transfer, or REST, in his PhD dissertation, Architectural Styles in the Design of Network-Based Software Architectures. It's a mouthful. Before that, he contributed to standards for URIs, URLs, and HTTP, and my alarm for my stand-up is going off so that I don't miss it. And had worked with Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web, at MIT's Laboratory for Computer Science. He had also co-founded the Apache HTTP server project and contributed to the creation of that server software. Fielding's descriptions of REST, like his title, are fairly academic, but the dissertation is something that I think a lot of us will run into at some point in our careers. To be honest, I don't read a lot of long-form technical content, but I did read his dissertation in preparation for this talk, so you're welcome. It would take a whole lot to really go over what REST looks like in Rails, and that would be an entire talk, and there have been several of those. One that I recommend is Derek Pryor's In Relentless Pursuit of REST from RailsConf 2017. At a criminally simplistic level, though, REST in Rails manifests as the 7 default actions that we get when adding resources to our routes.rb file, or that we get when scaffolding a new controller. Index, show, new, create, edit, update, delete. Those CRUD actions, as we tend to call them. And none of these were blessed or recommended by Fielding in his paper, but there are 7, so they are the 7 so-called RESTful routes that we use in Rails apps. REST in Rails also means the requests are stateless, meaning that client and server each maintain enough information to allow requests and responses to be handled in a fully encapsulated manner. So a client should be able to create a request, and it should be able to be handled by an entirely different server running the same software. Even though there's a SQL backend coordinating some of that state, those servers, you shouldn't need to be tied to the same server. It also encompasses the way that paths work in Rails, where an HTTP verb combines with a resource name and an ID to give us the default representation of an action like get/post/1/comments. Even if REST did predate Rails, there's no denying that Rails contributed to the idea's success and helped to popularize the concept. It was later adapted by ASP.NET Core, Django, Flask, Phoenix, many other frameworks. Another very Railsy idea is convention over configuration, meaning that the framework authors take a lot of leeway in making assumptions about what your application is going to do and how it should do it, and encoding those literally as the conventional path. For example, a whole blog could be scaffolded in just a few minutes by using Rails scaffold tooling, which would provide a controller with those 7 RESTful endpoints, views that back them, and a model and database representation that makes sense to represent the necessary data. It's just one example of convention, but configuration is easily achieved here by changing the files that have been generated, or changing some config file, or passing more flags to the generator itself. And those config files are themselves generated by the Rails' new code generator. While Rails and its contemporary Java Spring Boot certainly helped to popularize the concept of convention over configuration, the general precept that programs should attempt to detect things rather than force them to be configured had been written about by Eric S. Raymond in The Art of Unix Programming in 2003. That they should apply defaults but allow themselves to be overridden had been expounded on by Raymond and Rob Langley in 2004 in The Art of Unix Usability. And indeed, that programs should attempt to behave in the least astonishing way possible had existed for some time, as Jeffrey James showed us in 1987's The Tao of Programming, where his fictional programmer tells us that a program should follow the law of least astonishment. What is this law? It is simply that programs should always respond to the user in ways that astonishes them least. Even that master programmer was probably referencing ideas as far back as 1967's PL1 or the 1972 book series, which stated that that while systems should strive to adjust to the peculiarities of the user and that widely adapted conventions should be followed wherever possible, we should still adapt to what is expected of our programs. While we have the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see a path that leads from the law of least astonishment and the principle of least surprise to code that expects a structure, prescribes a structure in app models and views and controllers and attempts to detect automatically that we want our user model to read from the user's table. There's no doubt that Active Record is closely associated with Rails. The top 10 hits for Coggy on Active Record with spaces contains 5 references to Rails, which is actually lower than I would have thought it would be. But the design pattern Active Record, which has spaces in it, unlike the Active Record gem, which does not, actually does predate Rails, even if only by a little while. Martin Fowler had first published it in his a description of it in Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture in 2003, which was the year before Rails was officially released. Fowler actually attended or spoke at several RailsConfs and other assorted Ruby conferences over the years. And while I've never met him, he seems like a genuinely good person from what I've read from and about him. This is Fowler at the first RailsConf, I believe, in 2006. It might be 2007. Fowler described Active Record classes as closely matching the record structure of the database, with responsibilities for saving and loading data from the database and domain logic that acts on the data, but specifically not for converting fields from SQL representations, such as Rails does with some types like enums, unless you're smart and use strings. Active Record, both as a pattern and a library, seeks to encapsulate the concept of database interactions, such as retrieving, creating, updating, and deleting rows, SQL CRUD, as well as application logic. Rails extends the responsibilities of Active Record significantly, not only to mapping data to associated objects, but validations, callbacks, and generally trends toward junkiness in models if not managed carefully. If you've ever heard of God objects in Rails, Active Record, the design pattern, and Active Record, the gem are somewhat equally to blame for that, but we're the ones putting junk in the drawers. Active Record also takes other ideas, such as the unit of work, from patterns in the form of Active Record Dirty, which tracks changes in an object that haven't yet been committed to the database. As an aside, I've heard for years that anecdotally, Active Record didn't actually implement the Active Record design pattern, or that it diverged from it over the years, or that it no longer technically does. Something else I've heard is that it actually implements something closer to the data mapper pattern than that the Ruby data mapper gem, which is no longer maintained, also borrowed from the Active Record pattern. But in any case, I can't find original sources that describe any of that. And either way, Fowler also described Active Record or data mapper in the same chapter in the same book in the next section. If you have any actual references to this dichotomy, I'd love for you to come find me in the hallway so that I can learn about them. But all right, finally, Merb. Merb was a web framework that was released in 2006 as a cleanroom rewrite of Action Pack. It's sometimes seen as a competitor to Rails, but neither its authors nor the Rails team intended it as such. Its original author was Ezra Zygmuntovich, who was joined by Matt Eminetti, Yehuda Katz, and Carl Arch as principal contributors to the project, which lasted for about 2 years until the project to combine its ideas with Rails kicked off in 2008. Merb focused on modularity, public API for plugins and extensions, and performance. It existed in parallel to Rails for its entire life, and in late 2008, Yehuda Katz announced that the Merb team will be working with the Rails core team on a project to merge the things that made Merb different into what would become Rails 3 and eventually and unofficially Merb 2. On the same day, Ezra, Matt, Carl, and the Rails blog also published posts with their own takes on the announcement. Now, I won't go too deep into this, but Carl Arch and Yehuda Katz also created Ruby's bundler and Rust's cargo package managers. Yehuda also went on to contribute to JavaScript's Yarn, as well as Handlebars.js and Ember.js, which for a while seemed like the de facto choice until React sort of took over as the front-end framework. This is less true now after the keynote, maybe, but Yehuda and Carl's contributions to the Ruby and Rails ecosystems have been very influential, but their names are maybe less known by developers today, who are more likely to recognize more famous ones like Matt's or Aaron Patterson or Eileen Uchertel. The merger with Merb brought a lot of great ideas into Rails. It's when Rails was split from a monolithic gem with components like Active Record and Action Pack, which could be swapped out for other options like Data Mapper and RSpec as ORM and testing tool. It also brought in performance rewrites of certain parts of Rails that Merb had implemented. And importantly, Rails gained a documented public API, which allows for extensions, which are less likely to break across Rails versions, some of which include Simple Form for a more robust Rails form generator, Devise for user authentication, Sidekick, I don't know if Mike's here, but for background jobs, and my own Scenic, which adds support for Rails migrations and database views, which are used by, and which is used by a few popular Rails apps, including Mastodon and Lobsters. On a personal note, I wasn't doing work in Ruby on Rails at this point, but the Rails 2 to 3 upgrade ended up being notoriously difficult. And I did help with that at my first Rails job. So this is the first of these innovations that I personally observed coming into the ecosystem. Rails history is not one of reinventing the wheel. Built upon the ideas of the greater software development corpus, Rails stole ideas, and in doing so, it built itself into a tool that's really only useful if you want to quickly build a web application that will continue to be fast and maintainable for years, and on which you'll be able to build a successful business. Rails wasn't seduced by the problems of building a web framework from scratch. It was designed atop the battle-tested ideas of others. And as you build software, you should base it on another idea that Rails didn't innovate. Expose yourself to the best things that humans have done, and then try to bring those things into what you're doing. Steve Jobs, Trials of the Nerd, 1996. All right. I'm really happy to be here on stage at the final RailsConf. It's been really interesting to bookend my conference speaking career, not because I plan to stop speaking, but because the talk you just heard is my attempt on improving on another talk of the same name that I gave 11 years ago at Scottish Ruby Conference. I pitched this talk with the same exact title and abstract, but with a note to the program committee of RailsConf that with 11 more years of Rails experience and many more talks given, I thought I could give a better version of what was, to be honest, a good talk executed poorly. I hope that you've gotten something out of it. Speaking of the last RailsConf, I want to give thanks to a few missing faces of past RailsConfs. People who once attended or spoke at previous conferences and we just don't see around very often anymore. For a few years there, Sandy Metz seemed to be the keynote speaker at almost every conference. I met her at an unconference in Washington, D.C., and we bonded over a blog post that I had written about strict adherence to rules that she'd outlined in a Ruby Rogues podcast episode. This is the bottom line, she said. Your class can be no longer than 100 lines of code. Your methods can be no longer than 5 lines of code. I wanted 4, but I felt like I had to give them 5. You can pass no more than 4 parameters, and you can't make it one big hash. Your controller in a Rails app, when a call comes into your controller, it can only instantiate one object to do whatever it is that needs to be done. I guess I didn't copy them in, but the other rules is that your view can only reference one instance variable. And the final rule is that if you can convince your pair that you can break any of these rules, you can. Turned out that she'd come up with these rules off the cuff based on a question from one of the other panelists. But my team and I had just finished a project where for 7 months, we took them as core doctrine. This is a bad slide, I apologize. Did this during the keynote earlier. The blog post I wrote up about it is actually still up, and I think that strictly adhering to those rules will lead you to having a really maintainable, understandable code base that you'll want to keep working in for a long time, and more importantly, that other people won't hate you for having written. Sandy's also the person who taught me that a wonderful way to support a speaker in a conference is to be in the front row at a nod squad, reacting positively but quietly whenever a speaker says something interesting and maintaining eye contact with a friendly face. It gives the person on stage somewhere they can always look out to in the crowd and get a little boost of confidence as they give their talk. Around the same time, I got to know Katrina Owen. Katrina was a regular in the Ruby conference circuit as well, and we met at RubyConf Portugal in 2014. She had just founded Electron to help developers learn new programming languages. Not Electron, Exorcism. Yeah. At the conference, she gave a talk called Overkill on taking on a massive legacy code base, refactoring, adding tests, and generally making code more maintainable and less painful. But one of my most distinct memories of Katrina was from a few years later when we were taking a walk outside of a Go conference that she was speaking at, and I just happened to be in town for. We stopped at a crosswalk, and there were no cars coming, so I started to walk, but she asked me to wait. She told me that one of the ways that she helped herself maintain energy for making decisions through the day was that she never crossed against a walk signal. I hadn't been diagnosed with ADHD yet, but now that I have, and I think more about this kind of thing, the wisdom of deciding not to decide really jumps out to me. Finally, why the lucky stiff? I have no idea what Y's name really is, but he wrote a book called Y's Poignant Guide to Ruby, which was my original introduction to the Ruby language. It was 2008, and I just found out that my internship at a defense contractor, see my other talk, I Built Software to Kill People, would not be ending with a job offer, and that I had gotten an interview for working in a language called Ruby, which I had sort of heard of, in something called Rails, which I hadn't, to build apps, which I think are those things on your phone, for the web. I went through the guide. It was a whimsical, funny introduction to a community that I've now been part of for almost 15 years, and that all of you are also a part of, so thank you. It's something that I definitely want to give another read to soon, and if you haven't read it, you should as well. Other contributions include the original YAML API for Ruby, TryRuby, and my favorite feature in Rails, blank. Blank? This is 100% human-created talk. If all of you are going to spend your combined time here, it was only fair that I spend my time coming up with interesting things to say. Would like to thank my employer, Files.com, for sending me to RailsConf this year. Files provides businesses with file automation and delivery, and we have a very big, very custom Rails app. We're always looking for more Rails devs. Finally, I'd like to share something that I've been working on, an app for iOS and macOS called Village. The goal is to help you keep in touch with people, friends, family, coworkers around the world, across different time zones, by giving you a little reason to reach out. Right now, it shows each person's local time and weather, but I have a lot of other ideas of things that I'd love to add to it. And if you're interested, please go ahead and visit village.calebhearth.com to sign up for the test flight, and I'll get you added as soon as I can. Thanks. I've been Caleb Hearth. You can find me on Mastodon at caleb@calebhearth.com. Based on that, you can probably guess where else you can find me as well. And that's it. Thank you very much.